and welcome to the first of what we hope will be a series of interviews hosted by Medfield Together. I am Nicole Hall, and this is Julie Maviglia. And today we will be talking with Francie Latour, the co-founder of the Boston-based racial and social justice organization for kids called We the People. Francie and our co-founder, Tanya Nixon-Silberg, teach young children to notice and talk about how injustice shows up in the world. And they help kids to discover the power of their own voice to resist injustice. We the People draws on children's innate sense of fairness to empower them and connect them to the bigger issues of injustice in the world. They also support parents, caregivers, and educators in the art of having difficult conversations about difference, equity, and justice. We the People partners with Boston-based museums, schools, libraries, and other organizations, as well as many prominent Boston area musicians and artists. Julie and I have participated in and attended a number of their workshops over the years, and we can't say enough about how valuable they have been for us and for our kids. We the People has given us the language and the tools to engage more confidently with our children around the subject of race. Thank you so much for being here today, Francie. We're so glad you could join.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for those kind words. Gosh.
Of course.
We are trying.
We believe it all. Can you maybe start by just telling us a little bit about how We the People as a group got started and what motivated you to start a social justice group for kids?
Yeah, so We the People was founded in 2015. Both myself and Tanya, the other co-founder, are moms. And yeah, we were just ourselves trying to navigate how to raise our kids in a way that gave them racial literacy, that allowed us to tell the truth and give them a sense of agency about how they could use their voice to help create the world that they want to see. And that's really how it got started. And then we started realizing, wait a minute, a lot of other folks are trying to figure this out as well. That's really how it got going. And then I think increasingly we started noticing that, there was a real lack of racial and cultural literacy in a lot of predominantly white communities. And that has serious impacts for Black and Brown people, but it also has impacts for white people as well. And so, yeah, it just sort of took off really organically and continues to evolve, I guess I'll say.
That's fantastic. I know we definitely have benefited from that taking off in a big way. Can you tell us how you come up with the themes for your workshops? Because we've been to a few different ones. So what is it that you are trying to touch on with the different themes?
Sure, yeah. That's a great question. So I guess it's a combination. There are some things that are really important to We the People's kind of foundational programming. One is race and racism. And that's mostly because we recognize that kids have a lot of questions about race and racism. They've often been taught that it's something that they shouldn't talk about. And they notice and start to make meaning of racial differences from a very early age, right? So the research tells us this pretty exhaustively at this point, that by age 2 or 3, kids are starting to make meaning out of race and use race to reason for people's behaviors and attach value, hierarchical value to skin color. So all of those things are really important. We also do a lot of programming that is really Black affirming, and just really try to flip the script of something that I don't know, most people would call a script, but there's just this baseline kind of unconscious sense that Blackness is somehow like a problem, an issue, a stigma associated with deficit somehow. And I always tell kids, any kids, white kids, black kids, doesn't matter. Like, I love my blackness. I could do a whole workshop just on all the reasons that I love my blackness, and we would run out of time easily. And so we do a lot of workshops that enable kids of color to connect with that, connect with our own history, connect with Black culture and celebrate it, but also create opportunities for white kids to celebrate Blackness also.
I guess to that point and to what you were just talking about there, can you talk a little bit about from the white child's perspective, what a white child would be missing out on from your perspective if they're not having these conversations at home, and if they're left to do that work on their own? Is that something that you could?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a lot of times when I speak to white parents or educators, there's always kind of a conversation around, you know, when is the right age to start to unveil some ugly and uncomfortable truths, right? And there's this tremendous desire to like insulate kids from race talk, I guess you could say. And I think one of the things that is really instructive and helpful about the research that's been done is to kind of show us that that's kind of an illusion. There is no such thing as insulating our kids from making meaning around skin color and race. There's only, you know, either we find ways to make clear with them our racial justice values, our values of fairness, or we fail to do that, or we choose not to do that. And when we fail to do that, we create a vacuum. And in that vacuum, all kinds of messages around, like I was saying before, Blackness as a problem, as a negative, as a stigma, all of those associations rush into that vacuum. And so, yeah, I think kids who don't have an opportunity to kind of like ask the questions, just ask the questions, including like, what's my race? I mean, most white kids don't know their race, right? And so yeah, I think that knowing your racial identity is part of knowing who you are. Knowing that, you know, finding ways to understand like, well, race is real, but it's not real, like, or, you know, trying to explain to kids that, yeah, there was a time when people of Irish descent and Polish descent weren't white, and then all of a sudden they were, and they're like, what? Like, I don't understand. So that's all really, really confusing. And it's really our job as the adults in kids' lives to help them make sense of all of this, just like we help them make sense of everything else that they have to navigate in the world.
I think some adults probably have that same question mark over their head that says, wait, what? You know, I think there's a whole generation of us who was brought up to not ever talk about it, that it was something to be quiet about, and that idea of colorblindness. And, you know, now I'm so grateful that we're flipping that script, you know, definitely for our kids, to give them a better insight into race and the very real consequences of race. You know, but I do think there are definitely parents out there who would be surprised to hear that there was a time when Italians and Irish, they were not considered white. And I know that you handle that a lot in your adult workshops.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what the adult workshops are there for, and what sort of things you hope for the adults and caregivers and educators to take away from those workshops.
Yeah, so we have kind of a foundational workshop. It's called the ABCs of Racism. And it's kind of helping folks to develop building blocks of racial literacy. So racial literacy is just like any other literacy. We need it to be competent, knowing, engaged people in the world. We are all connected, and race is a very powerful way in which we may not realize that we're connected, but we are. And so having a sense of racial literacy means that, we can know, like, how are we responsible to each other? This is a question that's been on my mind all year long. How am I responsible to you? How are you responsible to me? And I think helping adults develop racial literacy kind of frees people from this sense of paralysis, kind of like being on the edge of this diving board, and you just don't want to move off from the board. You want to do anything but move off from the board. You want to pretend that you didn't hear your child's question, or you're mortified because they pointed out, Mommy, why is that lady brown? Like all of these things. And so our workshops really help to do a couple of things. One, slow down those moments by providing a framework that people can use that's really useful, and meet their child in that moment. And then also to understand that getting good at meeting your child in that moment, or any child in that moment, is really connected to doing your own self-work about your own identity, and really understanding racial identity for what it is, right? So, we have identities that are based on, heritage and ancestry, like you can be German or Japanese or Jamaican, and those are real things, right? They don't depend on anything else to exist. There's language, there's food, there's all kinds of things. There's places on a map. And whiteness is different from that. It's an identity that has a lot to do with how white people's lives turn out, but it doesn't correspond to any place on a map. It only corresponds to like a location on like a map of advantage and disadvantage. And so understanding that that is what it is really important to making the kinds of choices that model for a child what responsibility and justice look like. That was a lot, sorry.
So trying to piggyback off of that a little bit, from a parent's point of view, I can definitely relate to the idea of standing on the edge of that diving board. And I feel like I've had to overcome a certain amount of inertia that exists to be able to have imperfect conversations. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you might like to speak to the perspective of an educator and some of the unique challenges that an educator might feel, because these workshops are not just for parents, they're for educators too. And I know in some mostly white towns, educators have this sense of fear that having those conversations will, first, they might do it the wrong way. And secondly, the message that their kids end up taking home might be different. And third, even if the message is accurate, some parents might not like what they're hearing, unfortunately. So those are sort of unique challenges to educators. I was wondering if you might speak a little bit to what some of your advice might be for an educator attending a workshop.
I'm really glad you asked that question. So racial literacy and developing like a sense of anti-racism asks us to be extremely vulnerable. And so that's hard for a teacher because teachers, the whole way that schools are set up and the relationship between student and teacher is set up is that the teacher is the one who knows. Even now in this generation, which is different from my generation, where the teacher really was the only one who knows, now I think there's more of a sense of like we're all learners in a way. But the lack of racial literacy, I mean, okay, so we've created a world in which there's every incentive not to develop any racial literacy. And there's no incentive to do that, right? And so for teachers, I think a lot of the work is to abandon this desire to get it right the first time or the first 10 times or the first 50 times. Because it's like any literacy, right? You can't do calculus if you haven't done your times tables. Like you just can't do that. And the only difference between, developing literacy from multiplication to calculus and developing racial literacy is that, I think for white people, there's a difficulty to embrace the complicity, right? How people as individuals connect to these systems that are unjust. It's just a lot easier and more comfortable to see yourself as outside these systems. I'm just an individual. I'm just me, right? But we're all part of these systems. And so vulnerability is a really, really big part of it. And then like kind of lowering the stakes, like, because you can come back, you can be like, we talked about something last week and well, I want to talk about it again because I've been thinking about it and I was troubled by some of the things that happened. Or you have to be willing to come back to it and know that you can do that and know that it's not so much. I mean, there are things that you can say that do harm, and then you just say, I caused harm and now I need to repair it. That's what we do in a lot of other situations.
Yeah, I think giving permission to admit you have made a mistake and to come back and revisit has been something I have felt really empowered by as a parent. And I know that there can feel this pressure for educators to say, I have a week to cover something. I need to not make a mistake. So I like this idea of it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to revisit something. It's okay to say, I learned something new and let's be on this journey together.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that. I feel like that's a really important message to keep reiterating over and over again.
Yeah. And I think, teachers will find this journey a lot easier if, schools and school districts and states and our country sort of incentivize learning about this, right? Can you imagine if we disincentivized math literacy? That would be kind of crazy, right? But right now, it's interesting because so much of the conversation, especially around education, but lots of other things too, is sort of like, Black and brown communities at a deficit, sort of, like, oh, these terrible schools. And, but I mean, schools that have incredible material resources are sending white children out in the world with no racial literacy, no understanding of how their social location, right? They're like coordinates on this map of advantage and disadvantage, what that's about. And that's a huge deficit. Those are huge deficits. And that can change.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of people also worry about this conversation because it can feel very heavy. And I just wonder if the same way people don't like to talk about things that are scary or things like that, what has been your impression, or, how have the kids that you teach handled these concepts? Do they feel totally overwhelmed? How do they sort of take it as they go?
Yeah, so the good news is kids are just hardwired to understand justice and fairness. They just are. And, once you're able to connect it to that, then they're ready to go, when I talk about the race as sort of like this story, this lie that was made up so that Europeans could go to other parts of the world and steal and invade and take things that don't belong to them. And they're like, I mean, they literally will say, who did that? Like, I want names. Who did that? They absolutely understand it. And then they also can understand that, when you think about slavery, for example, like there were two parts to slavery. There were people who were forced against their will to work and to be separated from their families. That was one part of slavery. But there was this other part of slavery, which is like the lie that that had to be told to make it okay, right? And so, like with kids, I'll say, so, have you ever done something that you knew was wrong and you just come up with all kinds of excuses for why it was okay? Like there are no cookies left in the cookie jar and dinner's in 10 minutes. And then you have all kinds of excuses for why that's okay, right? So there are definitely ways to sort of engage kids in a way that does not leave them in a sense of sort of like this cloud of guilt or oppression. And I think a big part of that is saying, we can do something about this. We're actually not responsible for those lies, crazy lies that the Europeans told. They made their choices, but guess what? We all make choices, right? So what can we do with the power that we have right now? And kids will respond to that. They do respond to that every time.
Absolutely. Kids are remarkably fair, or they have a good sense of fairness.
Yeah.
When it comes to them anyway, not always others.
But, to them. Right, yeah. Which is the key, yeah.
But right, they're relating to it. So I remember being at one of your workshops with the kids, and I think you were talking about equity and the concept of equity as distributing snacks to people in the kids in the room that, if you're not hungry, why are you taking a snack? And if this person is hungry, why shouldn't they get two? And that way of looking at it was so, I had a 4-year-old there and she got that. So I think it's really beautiful that you can take those concepts that feel overwhelming and so big and make them so clear that a 4-year-old could understand it. I think that's remarkable. So do you maybe want to talk a little bit about the upcoming workshops in December and how the idea for that came about and the whole kind of circle of educating people and then connecting that to the people who are needing it most right now?
Yeah, so speaking of distributing resources. So yeah, I mean, 2020 has just been a whole lot for all of us. And at the same time, we can hold that it's been a lot for all of us, and that it has involved a lot of trauma for Black and Brown people. And so when we think about equity, we think, how can we make a world where everyone gets what they need, which is not the same as everyone getting the same thing, but everyone getting what they need, recognizing that, the world that we're in now is one in which some people have way more than they can ever use, and other people don't have what they actually need. The ABCs of Racism workshop is a workshop that usually when We the People does it, it's because a particular school or library or museum has asked for it. And so the number of participants is going to be limited, and it's usually for a certain group. And so instead, what we're doing is having ticketed anti-racism workshops, ABCs of Racism workshop, through Eventbrite, and all of the funds from those ticketed workshops will go to fund wellness services for Black and Brown people, kind of post-election heading out of 2020 trauma. And so there are a couple dimensions to this, right? One is we are giving folks an opportunity to come to the workshop individually or as a group to do this work. But we're also really recognizing that, the trauma of racism, racial injustice it happens in the body. It's not just a head thing. It happens in the body. It has, terrible impacts, devastating impacts in the body, physically, biologically, on individuals in the moment, and also collectively in Black communities, and also generationally. So that's a lot of compacted, cumulative trauma. And so by recognizing that, we can try to direct resources to address that. We are working with neighborhood health centers in Boston, and also with 2 wellness providers that are Black and Brown owned. One is Four Corners Yoga and Wellness in Dorchester, and the other is JP's Massage Therapy Center in Jamaica Plain. So we're really excited to be partnering with them for this initiative.
So I have 2 questions left for me. Nicole may have some more too. That's fine too. And one of them is lighter, because I always love to hear when kids are working with you. So I have a 4 and a 6-year-old, and some of the stuff that they come out with and their questions are sometimes hilarious and sometimes surprising and sometimes unbelievably insightful. So as we're working with these kids, what are some of your favorite moments from working with them? Or can you think of anything that sort of stands out to you as just being blown away by what they're able to understand and what they're able to sort of come away with?
So there's always a point when we talk about racism, we'll ask, well, whose job is it to fix racism? And they'll say, Martin Luther King. It's like, well, he's not with us anymore. And they'll say, Obama. And we'll say, okay, so yeah. So, Black people are the ones who are the most affected by racism, right? So, if I came into your classroom and just like spilled a whole bunch of, milk or tar or whatever it was, and then I left and I was like, I'm good. Like, it's not my problem. This is not my classroom. and you can see their minds just sort of like, okay, it's not Rosa Parks, it's not, and then some kid is like, white people? It's like, yes, let's go. So that's, yeah, and that always happens. And it's amazing when that happens. I think another is, so there's a workshop that I do about the Haitian Revolution called Breaking the Chains. This workshop has a lot of meaning for me because my parents are Haitian, and I always grew up knowing the importance of the Haitian Revolution, not just for Haitians, but for like Americans. So getting back to your question about teachers, Nicole, like it's challenging for teachers to disrupt like what's in the history books if they themselves haven't been taught history, right? So I always knew that, you know, without the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon never would have gone bankrupt. Then he never would have given over the Louisiana territories to Jefferson for like the equivalent of a yard sale, like, and that enabled westward expansion. Like, and so when we do this workshop and we talk about the heroes of the Haitian Revolution, you know, a few things happen. So, you know, we compare the Haitian Revolution to the American Revolution. And I ask like, who got free, you know, after the American Revolution? And they're like, everybody. And it's like, no, actually, first of all, you had to be a man. And the girls are just like, they're so pissed. And, you know, and you had to be white, and you had to be Protestant, and you had to own land. And they're like, wow, that's not a lot of free people. Wait a minute. And so, yeah, you know, but the recognition is, you know, it's always great to hear their responses to that. And to know that there was this whole other revolution that they were never taught. And then that makes, you know, we make these shields. They're hard to describe, but basically these Haitian hero shields. And it's really fun, and they love it. Like, what kid doesn't love a shield? I mean, come on.
Yeah, my kids have them here today because they love theirs. So don't worry, we'll show you their beautiful artwork. I think Sabine was 2 or 3 when we brought her into this workshop, and it was great. They loved it. So it was pretty amazing. It's a pretty amazing workshop. And I feel like me as a parent, I took away so much from that as well, because this wasn't taught to me. So it's amazing that now I have this and I can have that conversation and continue it.
One of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about that, Francie, was I recently looked at our babysitter's American history textbook. She's in 10th grade. And I was dismayed by, I guess, how similar it looked to my history book from a brief look through. It's not like I was sitting down and reading the whole thing. And another thing that struck me was the lack of passion, you know, the ability to speak of some of these events in our nation's history, and to do it with such a lack of, like, with such neutrality and ambivalence. And I don't know, it just, reading it today, I don't know, it was hard to, I just don't know how you do that. It's hard for me to really conceptualize, but that's sort of just an aside, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of history that needs to be unearthed and is being unearthed. And I think it's really important as educators that we all find ways to center, you know, those stories and histories that have been erased. Because we can't, not just because we can't know like those histories over there, like we can't know ourselves. You know what I mean? Like if you're an American and you don't know how you came about the Louisiana Purchase that makes America. That's something.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And then just in closing, I wanted to know, going away from this interview, what is the biggest piece of advice you'd like to share with anyone who's watching?
No pressure.
None at all, right?
Okay, I would say two things, which I guess is cheating, but one is that for folks who consider themselves to be doing the work, whatever that is, learning, Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, has a great quote. People come up to her like on a minute by minute basis at this point saying, "Oh, I just read your book." And it's just like, how would a person of color know that you've read the book? Right? That's really the bottom line. So that would be one message. And then I guess the other message for those who aren't reading the book, and don't recognize there's work to be done, I guess I would say what I said earlier, like, we are all connected. I think that this is, we've made a world where that's very hard to see and value. But that diving board that I was mentioning earlier, that fear of moving from that board is directly connected to the fear that Black and brown people feel every day about our lives. And so I think that it's really important to kind of, I don't know, lately I've been saying, like, think of yourself as an ancestor. Like, what kind of, so I'm very aware that, like, my Haitian ancestors their struggle wasn't even for their own, for like benefits that they would personally experience. Like, they were thinking about me even though I didn't exist. And so, like, in thinking about yourselves as ancestors, not in terms of like a material legacy, but like, what kind of moral legacy are you going to leave for your children's children's children, in thinking about this terrible burden and wound that has never been healed around race and racism.
A really powerful way to frame things. I like that in general, is to think of yourself as an ancestor and what am I doing to make life better for everyone and for future generations, knowing how interconnected we are. So
Absolutely.
thank you for that. Thank you for joining us today. This was really exciting for us.
Yeah, I hope I see, I think I'm going to see one of you, maybe both of you, at some of these workshops. But yeah, I hope to see some viewers as well. And you can find out more on our website. It's wethepeopleboston.org. It's we with 2 E's. And yeah, hope to see folks there.
We'll also post the information about on the Eventbrite page and all of that to make sure anything that we post would be there so people can check it out and sign up.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know that the girls wanted to show you their shields, if that was okay.
Oh, yes.
Had a second. Sabine, my love, they've found the ties, like the twist ties. So they're creating houses out of twist ties right now on the floor. But Sabine and Savannah, before Francie has to go, did you want to show her your shields? And then you can say hi to Courtney and Audrey too. They were hoping to see Audrey. They were hoping to see yours. This is Sabine's. Oh, we're upside down.
Yes.
Yes. And then here's Savannah's. So and this is
Love it. You've got some amazing heroes there. You've got Toussaint Louverture, and I think you've got Jean-Jacques Dessalines, no?
Yes. Oh, they're both Jean-Jacques.
Oh, they are?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I couldn't. It's hard to see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jean-Jacques Dessalines did not play. He was all business about freeing his people.
Mhm.
So I love it. I absolutely love it.